It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the AOC AG273QCX. The OSD is controlled by a joystick at the bottom of the monitor. By default it's illuminated with a red LED, as you can see here, or a few red LEDs. And there is also an Agon controller. If you prefer, you can also have a little ring of red LEDs around there. I'll just turn that on so I can show you what that looks like. So this controller, there are some numbered sections 1, 2 and 3, and they activate some gaming presets, and I'll come on to that shortly. OK button, and you can also navigate left, right, up and down as you can with the joystick, and there's also a back button. So it's a fairly intuitive way of controlling the OSD. But before going to the OSD itself, because some people will be looking at this video purely for this feature, I'm going to be talking about the light effects feature of the monitor. You can control this in the main menu system, or there's a little quick way to access it. So if you press right on the OSD controller or the joystick, you can control the light effects feature there. But to gain full control, you need to go into the menu. And then you can see there are various options. For example, you can define the colours used, the background red, green and blue, and the foreground red, green and blue for some of the other light effects modes depending on what you've selected. So when it's static, I've got it set up now so it's just giving me a kind of warm, slightly yellowish glow around the monitor, but it really is not a particularly strong glow. It kind of acts as a bit of a bias light, but it's not actually very strong, so it doesn't really light up the room or anything like that, or really light up the wall that well. But you can see there it does illuminate a bit, and it sort of acts as a weak bias light, and it's kind of a warm colour. Or you can edit that to whatever colour you want. So if you have them all set to 100, you'll get a kind of icy blue colour instead. You can of course go for whatever colour you want, full control over RG and B. So the various different light effects modes as well, static, which I had on before, audio, and this will react to audio, but the caveat there is that you need the audio to be passed through the monitor itself, otherwise the monitor doesn't know what's happening and it can't react to the audio with its lighting. There's a simple shift, and this kind of just gives a little wave pattern. So if I go around the back of the monitor, you can see what the ring of light effects LEDs are actually doing. So you can see they're sort of having an animated pattern, and that's how it illuminates the wall behind the monitor. I think the monitor's LEDs could be a bit brighter. As I mentioned before, the sort of with the static pattern, it wasn't massively bright, but it does actually sort of light up a dark room like this enough so you can see what it's doing. The various other things, gradient shift, sort of just a different pattern, sort of breathes there. Simple filling. I mean, I don't really intend to go through all of these because, I mean, I could be here all day. One-way filling. And some of these patterns also have these LEDs, which are called the foreground LEDs, around the joystick, doing various things as well. Two-way filling, and that just goes left and right. Breathing. Motion point, which is again a different animation. I'm not sure exactly what this one does. Personally, I don't really like the animations. I prefer to just use a static pattern, but there are quite a few options you can set, as you can see here. Demo just cycles through all of them so you can sort of show it off to people. But you can customize the colour between red, green and blue very easily, or rainbow, depending on the particular light effects mode you're using. So rainbow will just cycle through various different colours and use the pattern that you've selected there. So back to the static then, as I didn't really show you the sort of original red, green and blue. It's sort of reasonably bright red, reasonably bright green, same at the bottom of the monitor, or the same with blue. So again, not super bright, kind of does the trick if you like that kind of thing. but I do prefer user define. You can gain full control, so if you wanted, you can have that set to whatever your favourite colour might be, perhaps a nice purple colour, sort of pinkish purple. So I think before everyone falls asleep, I will move on to the rest of the OSD. So if you twiddle the joystick left or move the quick controller left, you can activate one of the game modes, you can cycle through them. I'll show you them in the main menu system though. If you press right, you can access the light effects quick menu. That doesn't let you define the actual colours that are used if you select user define, so you do have to go into the main menu to do that, but you can quickly cycle between red, green and blue if you prefer, and change the mode, so the pattern that's being displayed, and also how strong the light effects feature is, or you can turn it off if you prefer. If you press up, you can change the port used by the monitor easily, and if you press down, you activate this on-screen crosshair feature. There's only one crosshair design, this red design you can see there. You can't cycle various different designs. That's either on or off, and to get rid of that you just press down again. If you hold the joystick in for a few seconds, it'll turn the screen off. But note that if it is in a low power state, so it's lost signal to the computer, then you just have to press it rather than holding it to turn the screen off. If the monitor is in a low power state, the LEDs around the joystick, rather than glowing whatever colour you've set them to in your light effects settings, they'll glow amber, and if you press the joystick rather than holding it in, the monitor will turn off, or will turn itself onto standby, and all of the lighting will disappear, all of the lighting around the joystick area. The main menu itself has a refreshed design compared to some of the older Aegon products, so it has sort of a red with white highlights design with some sort of strange artistic looking icons. I wouldn't say I'm a massive fan of this, although I wasn't really a massive fan of, at least stylistically speaking, of their older menu system either, so it'll do. It's fairly easy to navigate, has lots of different features. Game setting, the first one, that allows you to activate one of the game modes. I don't like these, but when do I ever like presets on monitors, to be honest? You can set to FPS, RTS, racing, and these three, they lock off a lot of the settings, they oversaturate things, they oversharpen things, they completely upset the image. So you can see a lot of this is now greyed out, and the luminance menu is completely greyed out as well. If you go on colour setup, and I'll go through these in detail in a little bit, it's a lot of that's just greyed out. You can change the low blue mode, but nothing else. So honestly, I would just stick to having this set to off. Or if you need to, the Gamer 1, Gamer 2 and Gamer 3, they give you some more flexibility with the settings. You can now change the luminance, and you can't change the colour setup other than the low blue mode. But again, there's a strange sharpness filter, which I really don't like with these Gamer 1, Gamer 2 and Gamer 3. So it's a bit of a shame really, because it would have been nice to have 3 presets which were fully customizable and didn't have this weird sharpness filter, and then you could use the 1, 2 and 3 buttons on the quick controller to sort of cycle through your favourites. Next, there's shadow control, and what this is designed to do is to give you a competitive edge by making enemies more visible in darker areas or lighting up darker areas in your games. So if you set this to 60, unfortunately it completely floods the image. You can see with the background there, it completely destroys the black depth, and it destroys the contrast of the monitor because the black point itself is altered so that pure black is much lighter than it should be. There's no need to do that. BenQ's black equalizer and actually AOC's settings on some other monitors, they give much more gradual adjustments, and they also don't flood the image like this by completely destroying the black point. They should really leave black alone, they should leave the contrast alone, and just focus on those shades that are slightly lighter than black, because that's what you need to do to enhance the visibility without completely upsetting the contrast. So it's very extreme, 100, 90, 80, 70, 60, they all flood the image. If you have it lower than 50, it gives quite a cinematic look, but you actually lose a lot of detail because it crushes shades together, and it's again quite extreme, the difference between 50 and 40, but this doesn't adjust the black point because there's no way of doing that. It's a digital adjustment, this is, so it doesn't adjust the brightness of the backlight, and it doesn't adjust the black point, and it certainly doesn't positively affect your contrast. It just crushes things together and makes things look really quite dim. So basically, I don't like that setting, and it's quite poorly implemented. Game color, this is a digital saturation enhancement feature. If you increase this, it increases the saturation, and it does this by pulling shades closer to the edge of the color gamut. So if you increase this to 20, it's the most extreme effect. Things look completely cartoonish and weird. 10 is the neutral point, and this monitor actually has a very generous color gamut as it is, so most users will find that things look vibrant anyway once they've set other things up to their liking. If you decrease it further, you can have the monitor so it's completely monochrome if you prefer, or you can just have it less saturated if you prefer. So I can see this actually appealing to people more than the oversaturated alternative, because having it set to 10, you get the full shade variety. The native saturation of the gamut's also very high anyway. You don't need to pull things close to the edge of the gamut on this kind of monitor, and you just upset the image by doing so. Next up, there's MBR, motion blur reduction. This will be grayed out if you've got FreeSync active on the monitor, so be aware of that. And this is the strobe backlight function of the monitor, and it's explored in the written review. You can change the pulse width, so you can see, or you can probably see the screen flickering on the camera now. That's because it's a strobe backlight setting, and it's exactly what it does. If you increase this, it's dimmer. If you decrease this, it's brighter, but potentially has lower motion clarity. So the best motion clarity would be 20, but users will want to adjust this according to their brightness preferences. I found 15 worked well, and I mentioned this in the written review in terms of the sort of balance between motion clarity and brightness. Next, there's the FreeSync setting. So if you want to enable adaptive sync, you enable that, and then you can't use the MBR setting. Overdrive, which is explored in the review, you can set that to off, weak, medium or strong. I prefer strong. I was doing a little bit of testing just before this with weak, which is why it was set to weak, but I do prefer strong generally. Low input lag, this is grayed out if you've got FreeSync enabled, but it's basically enabled anyway if you're using FreeSync, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you're not using FreeSync or you're not using adaptive sync and you have this set to off, you'll then see that the low input lag mode you can enable or disable. I didn't see any advantage at all to disabling it, so I just leave it enabled. And actually, if you disable it, you lose control of the overdrive setting. So no matter what you set this to, it'll look the same as off. The exception being boost, and that's because boost, as you can see with the flickering again, it enables MBR at the highest setting possible. So that's what boost does. It enables your full MBR, and it's just a quick way of activating that. And of course, boost wasn't available before when I was showing you this, because that's because I had FreeSync enabled on the monitor. So the boost setting MBR is not available. Quick switch LED. So this gives you the little ring, the red ring around the controller, which I showed you before. You can have that on if you prefer. I find it kind of distracting, to be honest. So I tend to just have it disabled, but some people might like that effect, so they can have it enabled. Frame counter. And this will display the refresh rate that the monitor is running at. You can have that at the top right, the bottom left, or the top left. I wish they'd say it like I said it just then, because the way they say it, right up, right down, and left up, actually slightly confuses me when I'm saying it differently. But you know, you can choose which corner of the screen it's displayed. So you can see it says 144. That's because I'm just running at the native 144 Hz. It isn't actually a frame rate counter, it's a refresh rate display. So it only works if you've got FreeSync or adaptive sync enabled and you're using that. Otherwise, it'll just show you the static refresh rate that the monitor is running at. So next up is luminance, and that allows you to adjust the brightness and the contrast. Eco mode, and these just set the monitor to various different brightness settings. So all they do is adjust the brightness, nothing else, from sort of dim to bright depending on which settings you use. So there's no need to use them, just use manual brightness adjustment. It gives you more flexibility. If you are running the monitor in HDR, and I'll just quickly switch HDR on so I can show you this, then the eco modes actually change and they become HDR settings. As I mentioned in the review, I don't like these HDR settings, except for HDR, and as in the default one. HDR picture, HDR movie, HDR game, they upset the image in various ways, and that's all explored in the review. It's also worth noting that when you're in HDR, you don't have access to all the things you usually do. For example, you can't change the luminance, you can't change the gamma, you can't change the color channels or anything like that. It's all optimized and controlled automatically under HDR. Next is image setup. This only applies to analog VGA connections. So you can actually see with the new menu design, you can see what settings you could change. This is all grayed out if you're using a digital connection. And some users find that a little bit annoying because you can't adjust the sharpness. And some users do like to adjust that according to their preferences. And you can't do that unless you've got VGA connected, unfortunately. But the rest of it doesn't apply at all to digital connections. The other thing is HDR. So there's an HDR setup. Of course, that does apply to digital connections which support HDR. And you either have that set to off, which means HDR will never be used on the monitor, or auto, which means that when an HDR signal is detected, so you've got HDR enabled in your application or your game or Windows or whatever it is, it'll automatically switch to your HDR mode for the monitor as well. Next, there's color setup, and I know I've shown you this a few times, but now nothing's grayed out because I've got the monitor just at its normal off setting, and you can control all of this to your liking. So low blue mode, various different low blue light settings, from least effective to most effective, reading being most effective, and I use this for my personal viewing comfort in the evenings, and I mentioned that in the written review and say a bit more about what these do there. Colour temperature, if you have that set to user, you can adjust the red, green and blue colour channels manually, or you can use one of the preset modes instead. So there's warm, normal, cool, sRGB. sRGB is an sRGB emulation mode, which reduces the colour gamut. Again, that's all explored in the review. And warm is the default. Normal is a bit cooler than that. Cool is rather cool looking and not in a good way. It's just sort of a far too high white point. User, again, that gives you full control. DCB, dynamic colour boost. This allows you to oversaturate various different aspects of the image. So full enhance gives you sort of an increase of saturation overall. And this is much like the game colour setting I showed you before, except it sort of is a bit more selective about what it looks at. So full enhance is quite unselective, but nature skin will target the red and pink hues. Green field will oversaturate greens, and sky blue will oversaturate blues. Auto detect kind of looks at your content and will change this based on that. Again, as I mentioned, I don't like game color because there's no point in oversaturating in this way and losing shade variety with a monitor with this kind of gamut in particular. So DCB mode, play with it if you like it, that's fine, but I don't like it. I prefer a natural look with full variety. DCB demo, that will give you a split screen so you can see the left and the right look different, and it'll just show you what sort of DCB can do. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it's showing with the DCB mode on the left. It just looks actually more washed out and not more saturated, it actually looks less saturated. So to be honest, I'm not really sure what that's demoing, but they've always got these settings on AOC monitors. Sort of a slightly useless addition really. So as I mentioned before, red, green and blue colour channels. If you've got colour temp set to user, you can adjust them manually. Next is audio, and these adjust the settings of the integrated speakers or something connected to the 3.5mm jack if you're using that. But the speakers specifically have DTS sound support. There are various different settings. The speakers are reasonable as far as integrated monitor speakers go. They're actually quite good, but they're not amazing. And to be honest, when I'm gaming in particular, I sort of prefer the game setting. When I'm listening to music, I tend to prefer the rock setting if it's bass heavy music. The theatre setting's okay as well, but these just change the balance, the equalizer, according to different content types and preferences. If you've got that set to off, you can change the frequency responses yourself, so you can sort of change the equalizer yourself. I haven't had a huge play with this. To be honest, I prefer my headphones. Sound quality is better than the integrated speakers on this monitor, but you know, they're quite decent as far as integrated speakers go. They also have true volume HD, so that is a volume equalizer which will limit the volume for when things suddenly get really loud in your content and you don't want it to sort of deafen you. That's what that's for. Mobile phone, I'm not 100% sure what that does, to be honest. I think if you've got a mobile connected, that's sort of a special speaker mode for your mobile if you've got the mobile connected through USB. Next up, there's light effects, and I've gone through that already. Extra, so that allows you to change the input used by the monitor. Auto config, that's just related to VGA, the analog connection. Digital connections grayed out. Image ratio, off timer, that allows you to have the monitor switch off after a given amount of time in hours, and it'll go on to standby. I say switched off, but as if you press the power button to turn it off, and it'll give you a message on the screen saying it's about to do that, so it won't just suddenly do it if you've got this enabled without telling you. And if you press a button on the joystick or the quick controller, you can override that so it won't turn off. Image ratio, that's grayed out if you're using the native resolution. So that's all there is to the AOC AG273QCX's OSD menu system. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.